Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar, and yet something about it isn't quite the way we remember. Because what if everything you were taught about Native Americans wasn't exactly wrong, but quietly incomplete? What if the land you imagined wide, empty, untouched was never empty at all? What if beneath the forests, the deserts, the rivers, there were cities, systems, knowledge, entire worlds that were simply never shown to you? And what if the story didn't begin where you were told it did? Tonight, we're not just going to revisit history, we're going to sit with it slowly, gently, and begin to notice the details that were left just beyond the edges, the places where the story feels a little too quiet, a little too simple. Because the more you look, the more it begins to feel like something doesn't quite fit. A number that seems too large, a place that feels too structured, a presence that was never truly gone. And without realizing it, you may start to feel it too. That quiet shift, the sense that what you thought you understood might only have been a small part of something much larger. So tonight, we follow that feeling, not to rush toward answers, not to prove anything, but just to look again and see what begins to emerge when we slow down and allow the story to unfold at its own pace. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow just a little, and imagine a land stretching out before you, wide, quiet, endless. It looks empty at first, but if you stay just a moment longer, if you listen just a little more carefully, you may begin to notice it never was. I remember the way I first learned about Native Americans. It was quiet, almost too simple, like a story told in soft lines that never quite asked to be questioned. Small groups of people moving across a vast land, following the seasons, living lightly, leaving almost no trace behind them. That image stayed with me for years. It felt complete at the time. It felt enough. And I never really stopped to ask where that image came from. Maybe you remember something similar. A textbook illustration, perhaps. A short paragraph between larger chapters about empires and revolutions. A few sentences that tried to summarize thousands of years into something easy to understand. It wasn't presented as a lie. It didn't feel like one. It was just the version we were given. And for a long time, I accepted it without hesitation. I thought of Native Americans as people who lived close to nature, who moved when the land required it, who didn't build in the way other civilizations did. Not cities, not monuments, not the kinds of things that history books tend to linger on. It was a quiet kind of existence, at least in the way it was described. Peaceful, perhaps, but also simple. Too simple, I'm starting to realize. Because when I look back now, there's something about that story that feels incomplete in a way that's hard to ignore. Not obviously wrong at first, just missing something. Like hearing a melody with half the notes removed. You can still recognize it, but it doesn't quite carry the same weight. And I think what stayed with me the most wasn't just what was said, but what wasn't. There was very little about cities, very little about systems, almost nothing about scale. It was as if an entire world had been gently flattened into something easier to fit on a single page. And maybe that's what education often does. It simplifies, it compresses. It makes things easier to remember, but sometimes in doing that, it also makes things easier to misunderstand. I didn't notice that at the time, not when I was younger. Back then, history felt like something distant, something already decided, already understood by people who knew more than I did. My role was just to listen, to remember, and maybe to repeat it later. There wasn't much room for doubt, and yet, somewhere along the way, that quiet certainty began to shift. Not all at once, not with a single revelation, just small moments. Small details that didn't quite align with the picture I had in my mind. At first, it was easy to ignore them. A number that seemed too large, a mention of a place that sounded more like a city than anything I had been told before, a passing reference to something that didn't fit the idea of a scattered, nomadic life. Each one on its own was easy to dismiss, easy to assume there was an explanation I simply didn't understand yet. But the more I noticed them, the harder it became to let them go. And I began to wonder something that felt strangely uncomfortable at first. What if the story I learned wasn't wrong in the obvious sense, but incomplete in a much deeper way? What if it left out the parts that would have changed how I saw everything else? It's a quiet question, not the kind that demands an immediate answer. The kind that lingers, that stays just beneath the surface, waiting for you to come back to it when things are still and there's nothing else competing for your attention. So tonight, I want to sit with that question for a while. Not to challenge everything all at once, not to prove anything, just to slow down and take another look at a story that, for a long time, I thought I already understood. Because sometimes the most familiar stories are the ones we've examined the least, and sometimes they're the ones that hold the most surprises. The image I carried with me for so long was quiet, almost still, like a scene frozen at the edge of a firelight glow. I can see it even now if I let myself drift back to it. A few figures gathered in a clearing, their silhouettes softened by the night, the faint flicker of flames rising and falling in the center. Beyond them, an endless stretch of land. Forests, plains, maybe distant mountains. But no edges, no structures that stood too tall. Nothing that suggested permanence. It felt peaceful in a way that's hard to describe. Not empty, exactly, but light. As if nothing there was meant to last very long. And without realizing it, I think I began to associate that feeling with the people themselves, that they moved because they had to, that they built only what was necessary, that they didn't leave behind the kinds of things that civilizations are usually remembered for. It's a subtle idea, one that doesn't sound harmful on the surface. But the more I sit with it now, the more I notice how much it quietly shaped the way I understood everything else. Because if you believe that a people lived lightly, you start to believe they lived simply. And if you believe they lived simply, you begin to assume they didn't need complexity. And from there, it becomes very easy to imagine that nothing larger ever existed. I don't remember anyone ever saying that directly. No teacher stood at the front of the room and told me that Native Americans didn't have cities or systems or knowledge that stretched far beyond what I could see in those small illustrations. But somehow, that's still the conclusion I carried with me. And I think it came from the repetition of that same quiet image. Again and again. Slight variations perhaps, but always returning to something familiar. Small groups, temporary shelters. A life that seemed to move with the wind, rather than shape the land itself. There were no crowded streets, no layered structures, no sense of scale that made you stop and look twice. At least, not in the version I was shown. And when an image is repeated often enough, it begins to feel like truth. Not because you've examined it closely, but because you've never been given a reason to question it. That's what makes it so powerful. I never asked what might have been missing from that picture. I never wondered who chose those details or why certain things were emphasized while others seemed to fade quietly into the background. It felt complete. But now, when I return to that memory, there's a strange kind of stillness to it that I can't quite ignore. Not the peaceful kind. Something else. As if the scene itself has been simplified, reduced to only what was easy to show. And I find myself looking at it differently. Not as a window into the past, but as a version of it. One that may have left out more than it revealed. Because if that image was all there was, then the story would make sense. Everything would fit neatly into place. But if even a small part of it was missing, then the entire picture begins to shift. And that's where the discomfort starts to settle in. Not loudly, not all at once. Just a quiet realization that the way I had been seeing this for so long might have been shaped by something I never noticed. And once that thought appears, it's difficult to set it aside again. So I keep returning to that image. The firelight, the open land, the sense of something gentle and temporary. And I ask myself slowly, without rushing to an answer, what else should have been there that I was never shown? It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything shifted and I suddenly saw the world differently. If anything, it began so quietly that I almost missed it entirely. Just a small detail. I remember reading something, almost in passing, that mentioned a number. It wasn't even the main point of what I was looking at. Just a line, easy to overlook, the kind of thing your eyes might slide past without stopping. But for some reason, I did stop. The number was larger than I expected. Not impossibly large, not something dramatic enough to feel unbelievable, just larger than what I had always assumed. And that's what made it unsettling, because it didn't fit the image I had been carrying for so long. If there were that many people, then where were they all living? It's a simple question, almost obvious, and yet I don't think I had ever asked it before, because the picture in my mind didn't require it. In that picture, there were no crowded places, no sense of density, no indication that people gathered in ways that would create something larger. Everything felt spread out, dispersed, as if the land itself remained mostly untouched. But that number suggested something else. It suggested presence, not just a few scattered groups, but many, enough that they would have needed space, organization, some kind of structure to support that many lives over time. And the more I thought about it, the more the question began to deepen. What would that actually look like? I tried to imagine it slowly without forcing the answer. Not the familiar image of a few shelters under the open sky, but something with scale, something that required planning, something that didn't disappear as easily as I had once believed. And I realized I didn't have an image for that. There was nothing in my memory to fill that space, and that absence felt more noticeable than anything else. Because if something that's significant had existed, shouldn't I have seen it before? Shouldn't it have been part of the story, part of the way this history was introduced? Instead, it felt like I had been given only one version of what life looked like, a version that was repeated so often that it left no room for alternatives. And now, faced with a detail that didn't quite belong, I found myself hesitating, not because the new information was difficult to understand, but because it asked me to reconsider something I had never questioned. It's a strange feeling, realizing that a belief you've held for years might not be entirely your own, that it was shaped quietly over time by the things you were shown and the things you weren't. And I think that's when the doubt really began to settle in. Not as a sudden break, but as a slow shift, a quiet awareness that something didn't align, that the story as I knew it might have been built on a foundation that left certain things out. I didn't rush to conclusions. I didn't immediately assume everything was wrong, but I couldn't ignore it anymore either. That number stayed with me. It followed me into other readings, other small discoveries, other fragments that seemed unrelated at first, but began to form a pattern the more I paid attention. Each one subtle on its own, easy to dismiss if I wanted to. But together, they started to point somewhere, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done before. I started looking more closely, not just at what was being said, but at what might be missing in between. And once you begin to look that way, even the smallest detail can begin to feel like the start of something much larger. At some point, without really deciding to, I started to notice the spaces between things, not the facts themselves, but the gaps around them. It's a subtle shift, the kind you don't feel happening right away. You're still reading, still listening, still moving through the same kind of information, but something in the background has changed. A quiet awareness that there are pieces missing, even if you can't fully name them yet. And once that awareness settles in, it becomes difficult to ignore. I would come across a sentence and pause a little longer than before, not because it was confusing, but because it felt incomplete, like it pointed to something larger and then stopped just before reaching it. And I began to wonder how many times that had happened without me ever noticing, because the story still sounded smooth. It still flowed the way it always had. There were no obvious breaks, no clear signs that anything had been removed. Everything seemed to fit together, just enough to feel whole. But now, it didn't feel the same. There was a quiet tension beneath it, like something just out of view, something that should have been there, but wasn't. I remember going back, retracing things I had already read before, just to see if I had missed anything the first time. And what struck me wasn't what I found, but what I didn't. There were no clear explanations, no deeper layers waiting to be uncovered. Just the same surface repeated again and again and again. And that repetition started to feel different, not reassuring, but limiting, as if the story had been carefully shaped to stay within certain boundaries, to show only what was necessary and nothing more. And I don't think I would have questioned it if not for those small details that kept appearing, quietly, persistently, refusing to disappear. each one just enough to create a slight imbalance. A number that didn't match the image, a place that sounded larger than expected, a system that hinted at something more complex. Individually, they were easy to overlook, but together they formed something else. A pattern, faint at first, but becoming clearer the more I allowed myself to see it. And that's when the feeling changed. It was no longer just curiosity or mild confusion. It became something deeper, quieter, almost like standing in a familiar room and realizing slowly that one of the walls isn't where you thought it was. Everything still looks the same, but the space feels different. And I found myself sitting with that feeling, not rushing to fix it, not trying to force an answer, just letting it exist for a while. Because sometimes the moment before understanding is more important than the explanation itself. It's the moment where you allow the possibility that what you've known might not be the full picture. And once that possibility is there, even gently, even uncertainly, it begins to change the way you see everything that comes next. So I stopped trying to hold on to the version of the story I was given as if it had to remain intact, and instead I let it loosen, just enough to make room for something else, something I couldn't fully see yet, but could feel just beneath the surface. And for the first time, I wasn't entirely sure where the story was going anymore. But strangely, that didn't feel unsettling. It felt honest. For a long time, I held on to a number without ever really thinking about it. 13,000 years. It was presented so simply, so confidently, that it never felt like something I needed to question. The first people crossed a land bridge, spread across the continent, and everything that followed grew from that moment. It sounded complete, neat, almost elegant in the way it explained everything, and I accepted it without hesitation. But now, when I return to that number, it doesn't feel as steady as it once did. It feels fragile. Not because it's entirely wrong, but because it might not be the whole story. I remember the first time I saw a different timeline mentioned. It wasn't even emphasized, just a quiet reference, almost easy to miss, suggesting that people might have been here much earlier, 15,000 years, maybe more. And then another, 20,000. And then something that stayed with me longer than I expected, footprints. Ancient footprints preserved in a place called White Sands, dated to more than 20,000 years ago. I remember pausing there, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. If those footprints were real, if they truly belonged to people who had walked that land so long ago, then everything I thought I knew would need to stretch further back than I had ever imagined. And that stretching felt uncomfortable at first, because timelines are quiet anchors. They give us a sense of order, of sequence, of control. But when they begin to shift, even slightly, the entire structure above them starts to move. I didn't rush to accept it. I sat with it, slowly, letting the idea settle without forcing it into place. Because it's easy to dismiss something unfamiliar, especially when it challenges something that has felt certain for so long. But the more I looked, the more those earlier dates kept appearing. Not as bold declarations, but as careful suggestions supported by evidence that seemed to grow piece by piece. Monte Verde in Chile, a site that didn't fit neatly into the old timeline, suggesting human presence long before 13,000 years. And not just presence, but life. Structures, tools, signs of people who weren't just passing through, but adapting, staying. And I found myself asking a question that felt both simple and difficult at the same time. If people were here that early, then how did they arrive? Because the story I had learned depended on a very specific path. A narrow corridor of land, exposed by ice, a bridge between continents, used at just the right moment. But what if that wasn't the only way? What if there were other paths, quieter, less obvious, but just as real? Some researchers began to suggest something different, a coastal journey. Small groups moving along the edge of the ocean, following the rhythm of the shoreline, using boats or simple watercraft long before the interior routes were even possible. It's a different image, entirely. Not a single crossing, but many movements over time, adapting to changing landscapes, finding ways forward where none seemed to exist. And as I let that image form, slowly, without forcing it into clarity, it began to feel possible. Not certain, not fixed, but open in a way the old story never was. And with that openness came something else, a quiet realization that the beginning of this story might be far older, far more complex than I had ever been shown. And if the beginning changes, then everything that follows has to change with it. So I sit with that idea now, gently, without rushing to conclusions, just allowing the timeline to expand, to breathe, to stretch beyond the boundaries I once believed were fixed. Because sometimes, understanding doesn't come from finding new answers right away, but from learning to live with better questions. The more I sat with that shifting timeline, the more another question began to surface. Quietly, almost hesitantly. If people were here earlier than we thought, then how did they actually get here? For so long, I had only ever imagined one path. A narrow stretch of land, exposed by ice, connecting two distant continents, just long enough for people to cross before disappearing again beneath the rising sea. It was a clean image, a single doorway, opening and then closing, and everything seemed to begin from there. But now, that image feels incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily, just too narrow for something that may have been far more complex. Because if people were already here before that inland route was even possible, then they must have found another way. And that's where the idea of the coast begins to appear, softly at first, almost like a possibility you're not sure you're ready to accept. Not a single crossing, but a long, gradual movement along the edge of the world. I try to picture it slowly, without rushing. Small groups, moving with the rhythm of the shoreline, following currents, watching the tides, learning the patterns of a landscape that is constantly changing. Not cutting through the center of a continent, but tracing its edges, where land meets water, where food is abundant, where movement is possible. It's a quieter journey, but in some ways, more demanding. Because it requires something more than just endurance. It requires awareness, observation, an understanding of the sea. And that's the part that feels so different from the story I once believed. Because in that story, early humans were often imagined as reacting to the land, moving when they had to, adapting only when necessary. But this suggests something else. It suggests intention. It suggests that people weren't simply following a path, but choosing one. That they understood their environment, not just enough to survive, but enough to move through it with purpose. And when I let that idea settle, it changes the way I see them. Not as figures moving slowly across a frozen bridge, but as travelers, explorers, navigating a world that was far less certain than the one I know now. There's something almost quiet about that image. The sound of water against a simple vessel, the shifting horizon, the feeling of moving forward without fully knowing what lies ahead, and yet continuing anyway. It's not the kind of story that fits neatly into a single sentence. There's no clear beginning, no obvious moment where everything starts. Instead, it feels like a series of movements spread across time, overlapping, branching, adapting. Some groups may have taken the inland route when it became possible. Others may have stayed along the coast, finding their own way. Long before that path ever opened, and suddenly the idea of a single origin begins to dissolve, replaced by something more fluid, more layered, more difficult to define. And I find myself sitting with that, not trying to simplify it, not trying to force it back into something easy to understand, just letting it remain open. Because the more I look at it this way, the more it feels like the beginning of this story wasn't one moment or one path, but many, quietly unfolding across a landscape that was already full of possibility. And maybe that's why it feels different now. Not because the old story disappears, but because it becomes only one part of something much larger, something that is still slowly revealing itself, if we're willing to look a little closer and move a little more carefully through what we think we already know. The more I let those different paths settle in my mind, the more something else began to change, quietly, almost without me noticing at first. It wasn't just about how people arrived anymore. It was about what that arrival really meant. Because for so long, I think I carried a very specific feeling about this land without ever putting it into words, that it was new. Not new in a literal sense, but new in the way it was often described, as if it had been waiting, untouched, until people finally reached it. A vast, open space, empty enough to receive whoever came next. It's a subtle idea, but a powerful one. Because if a place feels empty, then everything that follows feels like a beginning. And beginnings are easier to understand. But now that feeling doesn't sit the same way it used to. Because if people were already here, long before the timeline I had learned, if they arrived in different ways over long stretches of time, then this land wasn't waiting. It was already lived in, already known in ways I may never fully understand. And I find myself pausing on that thought, letting it expand slowly without rushing past it. Because it changes something fundamental. It shifts the idea of discovery into something else entirely. Not a moment of arrival, but a continuation. A world that didn't begin when it was noticed, but had already been unfolding quietly for thousands of years. I try to imagine that, gently, not the image I was used to of small groups scattered across a wide and empty landscape, but something fuller, something that carries memory. Paths that have been walked before, again and again, until they become familiar. Places that hold meaning, not because they were found, but because they were known. And suddenly, the land itself feels different. Not empty, but layered. Not silent, but carrying echoes of lives, of movements, of stories that were already there, long before anyone thought to write them down. And I realize this is something I was never really taught to see, because it requires a different kind of attention, not just to what is visible, but to what remains beneath the surface. To understand that a place can feel quiet and still be full, that absence doesn't always mean emptiness, and that what we don't see is not the same as what never existed. I think that's what stayed hidden from me for so long. Not because it was impossible to understand, but because it wasn't part of the story I was given. The idea that this land, this entire continent, had already been shaped by people who knew it deeply, who lived with it, who moved through it in ways that left meaning behind, even when it wasn't immediately visible. And once that idea takes hold, even gently, it becomes difficult to return to the simpler version. Because now, when I picture this place, I don't see emptiness anymore. I see presence, quiet, patient, enduring. A presence that doesn't announce itself loudly, but remains, if you're willing to look just a little longer and listen just a little more carefully. And that realization changes the feeling of everything that comes after. Because if this land was never empty, then the story I thought I knew was never really about a beginning at all. And the longer I sit with all of this, the more I notice something shifting, not just in what I understand, but in how I feel time itself. Because time used to feel contained, neatly arranged, like a sequence of events that followed one another in a straight line, a beginning, a middle, and everything building towards something I could recognize. 13,000 years felt manageable. It gave the story edges, something I could hold on to, something that made everything else feel ordered, predictable, almost finished. But now, as that timeline begins to stretch quietly, steadily, it no longer feels the same. 20,000 years, maybe more. It's not just a number, it's a different sense of depth, a different kind of silence. I try to imagine it slowly without forcing it into something too clear. Generations, passing one after another, far beyond anything I was ever asked to consider. Lives unfolding, long before the earliest dates I had memorized. Stories being told and retold, not once, but countless times, until they become part of something much larger than any single moment. And suddenly the beginning of this story no longer feels close. It feels distant, almost unreachable, like looking across a horizon that keeps moving the further you try to see. And with that distance comes a quiet realization that this wasn't a brief chapter. It was an entire world of time, layered upon itself, slowly building, changing, adapting, long before anyone thought to define it. I think that's what unsettles me in the gentlest way. Not that the old timeline was completely wrong, but that it may have been far too small, too narrow to hold something that vast. Because when you compress time, everything inside it begins to shrink as well. Cultures feel shorter, lives feel fewer, complexity feels less necessary. But when you allow time to expand, everything else expands with it. And I begin to see that now. If people were here for that long, then they didn't just arrive and remain unchanged. They would have adapted, evolved, built knowledge over generations, developed ways of understanding the land, the sky, the rhythms of the world around them. Not quickly, not suddenly, but slowly, patiently over thousands of years. And that kind of time creates something different, something deeper, quieter, but far more complex than anything that could form in just a few thousand years. I find myself sitting with that idea, not trying to define it, just letting it exist, because it changes the scale of everything that comes next. Cities no longer feel surprising, systems no longer feel unlikely, knowledge no longer feels accidental. They begin to feel inevitable, as if given enough time and enough presence, something meaningful was always going to emerge. And I realize now that perhaps what I had been missing wasn't just information, it was perspective. A sense of how much time had truly passed and what that amount of time allows. Because once you begin to see history not as a short sequence, but as something vast and layered and unfolding far beyond what you were first shown, it becomes harder to accept simple explanations. Not because they are entirely wrong, but because they no longer feel sufficient. So I let the timeline remain open, wide, unfinished. Not something I need to close or resolve, but something I can move through, slowly, carefully, noticing how each new detail reshapes the space around it. And as I do, the story begins to feel less like something I was taught, and more like something I'm only just beginning to understand. There was a moment when I came across a name that I didn't recognize. Cahokia. It didn't sound familiar, not in the way other historical places did. It wasn't something I remembered from school or from any of the stories I had been told before. And yet, the more I looked into it, the more it refused to remain small. At first, it was just a place, a location, somewhere in what is now called Illinois, near the Mississippi River. But then, slowly, the details began to unfold, and with each one, the image I had carried for so long began to feel less stable. I try to imagine it now, not all at once, but piece by piece, walking toward a city, not a small gathering of shelters, but something that stretches outward, something that rises, something that holds shape. The ground not empty, but organized. Paths leading somewhere, spaces designed with intention. And at the center, something unexpected, large earthen mounds, carefully constructed, rising above the surrounding land. Not by accident, not by chance, but built, layer by layer, over time, shaped by hands that understood what they were creating. And I pause there, letting that image settle, because it doesn't fit the version I once believed. Not easily, not comfortably, a city. Here, not a temporary place, not something that moves with the seasons, but something that stays. Something that gathers people, that holds them together, that requires planning, coordination, shared understanding. And I begin to see it more clearly, the scale of it slowly coming into focus. Thousands of people living in one place. Homes arranged in patterns. Open plazas, spaces where people would have gathered, not just to survive, but to connect, to organize, to live within something larger than themselves. And then something even quieter, but just as striking, alignment. Some of these structures, placed in ways that reflect the movement of the sun, the turning of the seasons, a kind of awareness that reaches beyond the ground into the sky. And I find myself standing there, in that imagined space, not as someone who understands it fully, but as someone seeing it for the first time. Because that's what it feels like. As if this place, this entire city, existed just outside the edges of the story I was given. Never quite included, never quite acknowledged. And I wonder, gently, without needing an immediate answer, how many times have I heard about civilizations defined by their cities, their structures, their ability to build something that lasts, and yet never connected that idea to the people who lived here? It's a quiet realization, but it carries weight. Because if a place like Cahokia existed, if it held thousands of people, if it required knowledge, planning, cooperation, then the image I had carried begins to shift again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. I can't return to that small, simple picture anymore without feeling that something is missing. Because now I've seen something larger, something that doesn't fit into the narrow frame I once believed was complete. And I don't rush to replace the old image entirely. I just let this new one exist alongside it for a while, letting the contrast remain, letting the tension stay without forcing it to resolve. Because sometimes understanding doesn't come from choosing one image over another, but from allowing both to sit together until one begins to feel more real. And standing there in that imagined city, with the quiet rise of earth beneath my feet and the open sky above, I can't help but feel that I was never meant to see it this way before. But now that I have, it's difficult to look away. After sitting with Cahokia for a while, letting its presence settle quietly into my mind, I found myself wondering something else. If a place like that existed, If thousands of people could gather, build, organize, and remain, then surely it wasn't the only one. That thought didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, almost cautiously, as if it wasn't quite sure it was allowed to take shape, because part of me still held on to that earlier image, the one that felt familiar, the one that had been repeated for so long. But another part, the part that had started to notice the gaps, couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. So I kept looking, and that's when I came across something that felt different in a quieter way. Not a city rising from open land, but something hidden, almost protected, shaped by the land itself, the homes of the ancestral Puebloans. At first, it's difficult to picture because it doesn't resemble the idea of a city, at least not in the way I had been taught to recognize one. There are no wide streets, no towering structures that dominate the horizon. Instead, there are cliffs, high, still, ancient walls of stone carved slowly over time, holding within them something unexpected. And within those cliffs, carefully built into the rock itself, homes, layered, stacked, interconnected. Stone walls, shaped and placed with precision, forming rooms, passages, entire communities, tucked into the face of the land. I try to imagine approaching one of these places slowly, without rushing the image. At a distance, it might not even be visible. The colors blending into the cliff, the structures becoming part of the landscape itself, almost as if they were never meant to stand apart from it. But as you move closer, details begin to appear. Windows, small and deliberate, doorways leading inward into spaces that hold life, memory, presence. And again, I pause, because this also doesn't fit the version I once believed. This isn't temporary. This isn't something that moves with the seasons or disappears without a trace. This is permanence. Not in the sense of dominating the land, but in the sense of belonging to it, of understanding it deeply enough to build within it, rather than simply on top of it. And that kind of understanding doesn't come quickly. It takes time, observation, generations of knowledge passed quietly from one life to the next. And I begin to see that now, not as something abstract, but as something real. These weren't just shelters, they were homes, designed with care, positioned with intention, built in ways that protected against heat, against cold, against the shifting elements of a landscape that demands respect. And beyond the physical structures, there's something else, something harder to describe, a sense of connection. Not just between people, but between people and place, as if the boundary between the two had softened over time. And I find myself wondering again, gently, why wasn't this part of the story I learned? Why didn't I see images like this when I was first introduced to this history? Because once you see it, even in your imagination, it changes something. It adds depth, texture, complexity to a picture that once felt flat. And suddenly the idea of simple becomes harder to hold on to. Because there's nothing simple about this. Not the construction, not the placement, not the knowledge required to create something that could endure in such a place. And I don't feel the need to replace one image with another, to say that everything I knew before was entirely wrong. But I can feel it shifting, expanding, slowly, making room for something that was always there, just beyond what I had been shown. And as I stand there in that quiet, imagined space, surrounded by stone, by shadow, by the careful balance between shelter and landscape, I begin to understand something in a new way. That civilization doesn't always look the way we expect it to. And sometimes it's hidden in places we were never taught to look. And after seeing cities rise from earth and homes carved into stone, I found myself wondering how far that understanding really went. Because each place I had come across seemed to quietly expand the boundaries of what I thought was possible. And yet, there was still a part of me that held on to one last assumption, that certain environments were simply too difficult, too unforgiving for anything complex to take shape. The desert was one of them, dry, open, relentless. A place where survival itself feels uncertain, where water becomes the defining limit of everything else. And so, without ever saying it out loud, I think I believed that whatever existed there must have been smaller, simpler, more temporary. But then I came across the Hohokam, and once again that quiet certainty began to loosen. At first it didn't seem extraordinary, just a mention of people living in what is now the American Southwest, in a landscape shaped by heat, by distance, by scarcity. But then another detail appeared. Water. Not just finding it, not just following it, but moving it. I remember pausing there, letting that idea settle because it didn't fit the image I had in my mind, and as I looked closer, the scale of it began to reveal itself, slowly, almost carefully, as if it wasn't meant to overwhelm all at once. Canals. Long, deliberate channels carved into the earth, stretching across miles of desert, guiding water from rivers into places where it would not naturally go. Not by chance, not by accident, but by design. I try to imagine standing there, under that wide, open sky, the heat pressing down, the land stretching outward in every direction, and then seeing water flowing where it shouldn't be, moving through a network shaped by people who understood the land deeply enough to change how it behaved. And I pause again, because this requires something more than survival. It requires planning, coordination, an understanding of slope, of flow, of time. It requires the ability to think ahead, to build not just for the present moment, but for seasons yet to come. And that kind of thinking feels familiar in a way I didn't expect, because it's something I've always associated with what we call advanced societies. Cities that rely on infrastructure, systems that support life on a larger scale, knowledge that accumulates and is shared across generations. And yet, here it is, in a place I had once assumed could not hold such complexity. And I begin to see the pattern more clearly now. It's not just one place or one example, it's many, each one quietly contradicting the image I had been given, not with loud declarations, but with presence, with evidence that doesn't need to argue because it simply exists. And I find myself standing there in that imagined desert, following the line of a canal as it moves through the land, not rushing, not trying to measure it, just observing, letting the realization unfold at its own pace. Because the question is no longer, did they build? That question has already begun to answer itself. The question now feels different, quieter, but deeper. If they could move water across miles of desert, if they could sustain life in a place defined by scarcity, then what else did they understand? That I've never been taught to see. And I don't rush to fill that silence with conclusions. I let it remain open. Because sometimes the most important shift isn't in the answers we find, but in the questions we begin to ask. And as I follow that water slowly across the land, feeling the quiet intention behind it, I can't help but notice that the world I thought I understood is becoming something much larger than I ever imagined. And after seeing all of this, the cities rising from earth, the homes shaped into stone, the water moving through desert, I find myself returning, slowly, to that word I had carried for so long, primitive. It's a quiet word, but it holds a lot. Not just a description, but a feeling, an assumption, something that shapes how everything else is understood. I don't remember the exact moment I first heard it, or even if it was said directly, but it was there, beneath the surface, guiding the way I saw things without ever asking to be noticed. And now, standing here with these images settling one by one, it doesn't feel the same anymore. I try to place it gently, next to what I've seen, a city like Cahokia, organized, intentional, aligned with the sky, homes built into cliffs designed with care, shaped to last, water carried across miles of desert, guided by knowledge that took generations to understand. And I wait, just for a moment, to see if the word still fits. But it doesn't. Not comfortably, not honestly. Because the more I look, the more I realize that the word was never describing what was there. It was describing how little I had been shown. And that realization arrives quietly, but it lingers. Because it shifts something deeper than just information. It changes the frame. The way I've been taught to recognize complexity, to define what counts as a civilization, to decide what is worth remembering, and what can be left behind. And I begin to see that maybe the issue was never the absence of complexity, but the absence of recognition, that these places, these systems, these ways of living were always there, not hidden, not secret, just not included. And I sit with that thought without rushing to judge it, without trying to resolve it too quickly, because it carries a certain weight, not heavy in a dramatic way, but steady, like something that settles slowly over time. I think about how easily an image can become fixed, how repetition can make something feel true, even when it's incomplete, how a single perspective shown often enough can quietly replace everything else. And I wonder, gently how many other things I've come to understand in a similar way. Not because they were explained in detail, but because they were simplified just enough to feel complete. And now, standing at this point in the story, I don't feel like I've uncovered everything. If anything, I feel like I've only just begun to see the outline of something much larger. But even that is enough to change the way I look at what comes next. Because I can't return to that earlier image anymore, not without noticing what's missing. I can't hold on to that word, primitive, without feeling the distance between it and what I've now seen. And I don't need to replace it with another label or rush to define something new. I can just let it fall away quietly without resistance, making space for something more accurate even if I don't fully understand it yet. And maybe that's where this part of the journey leads. Not to a final answer, but to a clearer way of seeing. One that doesn't reduce or simplify, but allows things to remain as they are, complex, layered, real. And as I let that settle slowly, I realized that what I once thought was the full picture was only ever a fragment. After sitting with those cities, those structures, those systems that quietly reshaped what I thought I understood, I began to notice something else, something even more subtle, and in a way, more difficult to see. It wasn't about what was built, not in the obvious sense. It was about the land itself. Because for as long as I can remember, I've carried a very particular image of places like the Amazon. Endless forest, thick, untamed, something wild, something that existed almost outside of human influence, a place where nature remained untouched. And that idea felt almost comforting, because it created a contrast. On one side, civilization, cities, structure. On the other, wilderness, untouched, pure. It felt like a clear boundary, but now that boundary doesn't feel as clear as it once did. I came across a phrase quietly, almost as if it wasn't meant to draw too much attention. Engineered landscape. And I paused there, because those two words don't usually belong together. A forest, engineered, it feels contradictory at first, but the more I sit with it, the more it begins to make sense, in a way that isn't immediately obvious. I try to imagine the forest differently, not as something separate from people, but as something shaped, slowly over time. Not through large, sudden changes, but through small, consistent actions, planting, tending, returning to the same places generation after generation, encouraging certain plants to grow while others fade. Creating patterns not visible all at once, but forming quietly beneath the surface. And then something else appears. Soil. Dark, rich, unexpectedly fertile in a place where the natural soil is often thin and difficult to sustain. Terra preta, they call it, black earth. Not formed by chance, but created. Built up slowly, through knowledge, through intention, through an understanding of how to shape the land, not by forcing it, but by working with it. And I find myself pausing again, letting that idea settle, because it changes something fundamental. This isn't a story of people simply living in nature, it's a story of people shaping it, quietly, patiently, over long stretches of time. Not in ways that dominate or erase, but in ways that blend, that integrate, that become part of the system itself. And suddenly the forest doesn't feel untouched anymore. It feels inhabited, not in the visible sense, not in the way cities announce themselves, but in a deeper way, as if the patterns within it carry the memory of human presence, even when that presence isn't immediately seen. And I realized this is something I was never taught to recognize, because it doesn't look like construction or architecture or anything that fits easily into the categories I've been given. It's quieter than that, more gradual, more subtle, but no less intentional. And I begin to wonder, gently, how many times have I looked at a place and assumed it was natural, simply because I didn't know how to see the human influence within it? How many landscapes that feel wild are actually the result of long, careful interaction, shaped by knowledge passed through generations? It's not an easy thing to see, because it requires a different way of looking, not just at what stands out, but at what blends in. At patterns that don't announce themselves, but reveal themselves slowly, if you stay long enough and pay attention. And as I sit with that, letting the image of the forest shift from untouched to shaped, from separate to connected, I can feel something else beginning to change. The idea that civilization must always leave behind something obvious, something visible, something that can be easily pointed to. Because now I'm starting to see that sometimes the most profound changes are the ones that don't look like change at all. As I sit with that idea, the forest shaped quietly over time, the soil carrying memory beneath the surface, I begin to notice something else, something even more difficult to hold on to, because it doesn't leave behind anything you can easily see. Knowledge. Not written, not stored in books, not preserved in a way that feels familiar to me, but still very much there. And I realize this is where my understanding begins to feel less certain, because for most of my life, I've associated knowledge with something physical. Pages, libraries, records, things that can be revisited, checked, held in place, something that stays even when people are gone. But what happens when knowledge lives differently, when it isn't written down but carried from one person to another across generations? At first, it's easy to underestimate that, to assume it's fragile, incomplete, easily lost. But the more I think about it, the more that assumption begins to feel too simple. Because oral traditions, the kind that are spoken, remembered, repeated, aren't random. They follow patterns, stories, structured in ways that make them easier to remember, rhythms, images, connections to place, to time, to experience. And over generations, those stories don't just survive. They refine, they adapt, but they also preserve. And I begin to see that now, not as something lesser, but as something different. A system of knowledge that lives in memory, in language, in relationship. I try to imagine what that would feel like, slowly, without rushing past it. To know the land not from a map, but from experience. To understand seasons, not from numbers, but from signs, from patterns, from observation repeated over time. To carry stories, not as something written, but as something spoken, something shared, something that changes slightly but holds on to its core. And I pause there because it requires a different kind of trust. Trust in memory, in community, in continuity. And I realize that kind of knowledge doesn't disappear just because it isn't written. It exists in a different form, one that is harder to extract, harder to measure, but no less real. And maybe that's why it was easier to overlook, because it doesn't leave behind the kinds of traces that we've been taught to recognize as evidence. There are no libraries to walk through, no pages to turn, but there are voices, stories, relationships that carry meaning forward, even when they aren't fixed in place. And I begin to wonder, gently, how much knowledge has been dismissed simply because it didn't appear in a form we expected. How many systems of understanding have been overlooked because they didn't fit into the structures we're familiar with? It's not a comfortable question, but it feels necessary. Because when I think back to everything I've seen so far, the cities, the structures, the land itself being shaped, it becomes harder to believe that knowledge was ever absent. If anything, it must have been present deeply, consistently, guiding decisions, shaping lives over long periods of time. And perhaps it was simply expressed in ways I wasn't taught to recognize. So I sit with that now, quietly, not trying to define it too quickly, not trying to translate it into something more familiar, just allowing it to remain as it is, a different way of knowing. One that doesn't rely on permanence in the way I once believed it had to, but still endures through memory, through connection, through time. And the more I allow that possibility, the more I begin to feel that what I once thought was missing may have been there all along, just waiting to be understood differently. As I sit with this idea of knowledge, carried through memory, shaped by experience, I begin to notice something else, something that feels both familiar and strangely overlooked at the same time. Science. Not the kind I learned in school, not neatly divided into subjects, not written in formulas or diagrams, but something quieter, something embedded in observation, in repetition, in the slow accumulation of understanding over time. At first, it's difficult to recognize it that way because I've been taught to look for science in very specific forms, in instruments, in written theories, in structures that can be measured, tested, and recorded. But what if science can exist without those forms? What if it can live in practice, in patterns, in the careful attention paid to the world over generations? I think about the sky, the way it changes night after night, season after season. To me, it's something I might notice briefly and then forget. But for people who live close to the land, who depend on those patterns, it becomes something else entirely. A guide, a system, a way of understanding time, direction, movement. And I begin to imagine, slowly, looking up at that same sky, not as something distant, but as something meaningful, recognizing the position of stars, the cycle of the moon, the shifting path of the sun, not as isolated observations, but as part of a larger pattern, something that can be learned, remembered, passed on. And that feels like science, not written down, but no less precise. Then I think about medicine, not in the way I usually understand it, with hospitals, with prescriptions, with controlled studies, but something more immediate, more connected to the land. Plants, roots, leaves, each one observed, tested, understood through experience. Not once, not twice, but over generations, learning what heals, what harms, what must be prepared carefully, what must be avoided. And I pause there because that kind of knowledge doesn't come quickly. It requires time, patience, attention, a willingness to observe and remember over long periods. And again, it begins to feel familiar in a way I hadn't expected, because these are the same foundations that science is built upon. Observation, pattern, repetition, refinement, just expressed differently. And I realize slowly that what I had been taught to see as science might only be one version of it. One way of organizing knowledge, one way of recording it, one way of sharing it, but not the only way. And when I allow that idea to settle, it changes something, because now the absence of written records doesn't feel like the absence of knowledge anymore. It feels like a difference in form, a different language for understanding the world. And I begin to wonder, gently, how many systems of knowledge have been overlooked simply because they didn't look the way we expected them to? How many observations, discoveries, understandings have existed quietly, embedded in daily life, without ever being recognized as what they truly are? It's a quiet shift, but a meaningful one, because it allows me to see what's there rather than focusing only on what I can easily identify. And as I sit with that, letting the idea expand slowly, I begin to feel something else, a kind of respect, not imposed, not forced, but emerging naturally from the recognition that understanding can take many forms, that intelligence doesn't always announce itself in ways that are easy to measure, and that sometimes the most refined knowledge is the kind that blends so seamlessly into life that it becomes almost invisible, unless you know how to look. So I stay with that thought, quietly, not trying to define it too quickly. Not trying to compare it, just allowing it to exist alongside everything I thought I knew. And in doing so, I begin to see that what I once considered absence may have been something far more complete than I ever realized. And as all of this begins to settle, the land shaped quietly, knowledge carried without writing, science existing in forms I hadn't learned to recognize, I find myself returning to a question, one that feels simple, but unfolds the longer I sit with it. What does intelligence actually look like? For so long, I think I've been taught to recognize it in very specific ways. Structures that rise above the land, systems that can be mapped, knowledge that is written, categorized, preserved in ways that feel permanent. Something visible, something measurable, something that can be pointed to and named. And anything that didn't fit that shape felt less clear, less defined, maybe even less advanced. But now, after everything I've seen, that idea begins to feel incomplete. Not wrong, just too narrow. Because what I'm beginning to notice slowly, carefully, is that intelligence doesn't always present itself in ways that stand apart from the world. Sometimes it blends into it so seamlessly that it becomes difficult to see unless you change the way you're looking. I think about the forest again, not as something wild and untouched, but as something shaped, guided, influenced over time in ways that don't disrupt its appearance. And I realize that shaping something without making it obvious might require a different kind of understanding altogether. One that doesn't impose, but listens. One that doesn't force change, but works with it. And that kind of intelligence is harder to measure because it doesn't leave behind sharp edges or clear boundaries. It leaves behind balance, patterns that feel natural even when they are not entirely so. And I begin to see that this way of thinking extends beyond the land, into knowledge, into systems, into the way people understood their place within the world. Not separate from it, but part of it. And that idea feels unfamiliar in a quiet way. Because so much of what I've learned has been built around separation. Humans and nature, culture and environment, knowledge and life. Clear distinctions, clear categories. But here those boundaries seem to soften, to blur, just enough that it becomes difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. And I sit with that without trying to resolve it too quickly, because it changes how I understand everything I've seen so far. The cities no longer feel like exceptions. The knowledge no longer feels surprising. The systems no longer feel hidden. They begin to feel consistent, as if they all emerge from the same way of seeing the world, a way that values connection, continuity, balance, rather than separation, control, or dominance. And I realized, gently, that perhaps what I had been missing wasn't just information, but a different perspective entirely, a different way of recognizing complexity. Because complexity doesn't always appear as something complicated. Sometimes it appears as something harmonious, something that works so well that it doesn't draw attention to itself, and that is easy to overlook, especially if you've been taught to look for something else. So I let that thought settle slowly without forcing it into a conclusion, just allowing it to remain open, unfinished, because it feels like I'm only beginning to understand it. And maybe that's enough for now. Not to define it completely, but to recognize that what I once thought was simple may have been something far more refined than I ever knew how to see. And after everything I've been sitting with, the cities, the knowledge, the land shaped quietly over time, I find myself returning to something I've heard many times before but never really questioned. The idea that when Europeans first arrived, they found a vast, empty land, open, waiting, untouched. It's a familiar image, one that feels almost natural because it has been repeated so often in so many different ways. A new world, discovered, a beginning. But now, that image doesn't settle the way it used to, because it doesn't align with what I've started to see. If there were cities, if there were systems, if there were people living across this land for thousands, even tens of thousands of years, then how could it have been empty? That question lingers quietly, but it doesn't go away. And so, I begin to look a little closer. Not at the moment of arrival itself, but at what might have happened just before and just after. And what I find isn't a single event. It's something slower and far more difficult to see. Disease. Not something dramatic, not something that announces itself loudly in the story, but something that moves silently, quickly, without needing to be noticed. Illnesses carried across oceans from one world to another where the people had never encountered them before. And I pause there because it changes everything in a way that is easy to overlook if you move too quickly past it. Because this isn't a story of immediate conflict or sudden disappearance. It's something else, something gradual but devastating. Communities weakened before they ever saw those who arrived. Villages emptied without explanation. Knowledge interrupted. Not because it was lost, but because those who carried it were no longer there to pass it on. And I sit with that image, slowly, without rushing, not as something abstract, not as a number, but as something lived. People who had always known this land, suddenly facing something they couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't prepare for. And the land itself changing in response. Fields no longer tended, paths no longer walked, places that once held life becoming quiet, not because they were never there, but because something had passed through them unseen. And then, much later, others arrive, and what they see is not the full story. They see space, silence, absence, and it begins to make sense. How that image of an empty land could take hold, because what they encountered may have already been changed before they ever stepped into it. And that realization feels heavy in a quiet way, not overwhelming, not loud, but steady, because it suggests that what was seen was not what had always been there. It was what remained after something had already taken so much. And I find myself sitting with that without trying to resolve it too quickly, because it shifts the meaning of everything that comes after. It changes the idea of discovery into something more complicated, something that carries layers. Because if the land appeared empty, not because it was, but because it had been emptied, then the story begins somewhere else entirely. Not at the moment of arrival, but in what had already been lost before that moment ever came into view. And I let that thought remain, gently, not as a conclusion, but as something that continues to unfold the longer I sit with it. And as I sit with that quiet absence, the land that seemed empty but wasn't, the silence that followed something unseen, I begin to notice that not everything was lost in the same way. Because even after disease, even after disruption, even after so much had already changed, there were still people, still communities, still voices, still knowledge, trying to continue to adapt, to survive in a world that no longer felt the same. And yet, what followed wasn't just about what had already been taken. It was about something else, something more deliberate, something that didn't happen by accident. I came across a phrase once and it stayed with me, not because it was loud, but because it was so direct. Kill the Indian, save the man. And I remember pausing there, letting the words settle slowly, because they don't need much explanation. They carry what they represent takes time to understand. Because this wasn't about land, not in the immediate sense. It wasn't about cities or systems or even survival in the way I had been thinking before. It was about identity, language, memory, culture, the things that exist within people rather than around them. And I try to imagine what that would feel like, gently, without rushing past it. Children, taken from their families, placed into environments where everything familiar was removed. Haircut, names changed. Languages forbidden. Stories no longer told. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were no longer allowed. And I sit with that image, quietly, because it's different from everything I've been thinking about so far. There are no structures to look at, no landscapes to reimagine, no visible systems to trace, just absence. But a different kind of absence, one that doesn't come from something fading naturally over time, but from something being intentionally erased. And that feels difficult to hold on to at first, because it's not a single moment. It's something that happens again and again across generations. Small changes repeated often enough until they begin to reshape something deeper. And I begin to understand, slowly, that loss doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like silence, like a language no longer spoken, like a story that isn't passed on, like a connection that becomes harder to recognize with each passing generation. And I wonder, quietly, how much knowledge, how many ways of understanding the world have been affected, not because they disappeared on their own, but because they were no longer allowed to continue. It's not an easy thought, but it feels necessary to sit with it. Because when I look back at everything I've been seeing, the cities, the knowledge, the relationship with the land, it becomes clear that what existed here was never fragile. It didn't simply vanish. It was interrupted, and even then, not completely. Because despite everything, something remained, something that continued, quietly, beneath the surface, even when it wasn't visible in the ways I had been taught to recognize. And I think that's what I'm beginning to understand now, that survival doesn't always look like resistance in the way we expect. Sometimes it looks like persistence, holding on to what can be held even when so much else has changed, adapting without entirely letting go. And I sit with that idea, letting it settle slowly, because it shifts something again, not just what was lost, but what endured, and perhaps what still remains even now in ways I'm only just beginning to notice. And the more I sit with that idea of persistence, of something continuing quietly beneath the surface, the more I realize that there's another part of the story that I had never really seen clearly before. Because for a long time, I think I understood Native Americans, mostly in terms of what happened to them, what was taken, what was lost, what was changed. And while those things are real and important, they're not the whole picture. There's something else. It's something that doesn't fit into that quiet image of disappearance or silence. Resistance, not always loud, not always visible in the ways I might expect, but present, steady, intentional. I begin to come across names, not in long lists, not presented as central figures in the stories I learned, but there, if I look closely enough. Tecumseh, Sitting Bull. And I pause there, not because I know everything about them, but because their presence alone suggests something different. Not passivity, not quiet fading away, but action, decision, strategy. And I try to imagine that, slowly, without rushing into familiar narratives of conflict or battle. Because what stands out to me isn't just the fact that resistance existed, but how it took shape. Tecumseh, working to bring different groups together, not through force, but through shared understanding, through the idea that something larger could exist if people chose to see it that way. A kind of unity, not imposed, but built. And I sit with that because it requires vision. It requires the ability to see beyond the present moment, to recognize patterns, to anticipate what might come next. And that feels like intelligence of a different kind. Then, Sitting Bull not only as a leader in moments of conflict, but as someone navigating a changing world, making decisions within circumstances that were shifting constantly, where every choice carried weight, far beyond the immediate. And again, I pause, because this isn't a story of simple reaction. It's a story of adaptation, of people thinking, responding, adjusting in ways that aren't always visible in the surface of history. And I begin to understand something slowly, that resistance doesn't always look like opposition in a single moment. Sometimes it's a long process, a series of choices made over time, each one shaped by knowledge, by memory, by an understanding of what is at stake. And I wonder, gently, how many of these stories, how many of these decisions have remained just outside the version of history I was shown? Because once I begin to see this, even in fragments, it becomes harder to hold on to that earlier image of people simply overwhelmed or unable to respond. That image feels incomplete now because it leaves out something essential: agency, the ability to act, to choose, to shape what happens next, even in the face of uncertainty, even in the face of loss. And I sit with that quietly, not trying to reconstruct every detail, not trying to fill in every gap, just allowing that presence to exist alongside everything else I've been learning, because it changes the tone of the story. It shifts it from something that only moves in one direction toward loss to something more complex, something that includes movement, response, intention, even when the outcome isn't what we might hope for. And as I let that settle, I begin to feel that what I'm seeing now isn't just a story of what happened, but a story of how people move through it, not passively, but with awareness, with strategy, with a kind of quiet strength that doesn't always announce itself, but remains if you look closely enough. And once you begin to notice that, it becomes difficult to look at the past in quite the same way again. And as I reach this point, after everything I've been sitting with, the shifting timelines, the cities I never knew existed, the land shaped quietly over generations, the knowledge carried without being written, the loss, the interruption, the persistence, I find myself returning to where this all began. That simple image, the one that felt so complete for so long, small groups, moving across an open land, leaving little behind. It's still there, in a way. But now it feels different. Not wrong, exactly, just incomplete, like a fragment of something much larger. And I don't feel the need to replace it with something else, just as simple. Because what I've come to see doesn't fit into a single image anymore. It doesn't stay still. It moves, it shifts, it unfolds, depending on where you stand and how long you're willing to look. And maybe that's what this has really been about. Not finding a new version of the story that feels final, but learning to sit with a story that is more complex than I expected. One that doesn't resolve easily, one that doesn't offer a clear beginning or a clean ending. Because the more I think about it now, the more I realize this was never just a story about the past. It's something else, something that continues. I think about the people who are still here, today, not as distant figures, not as something preserved in history, but as part of the present, living, working, creating, remembering, rebuilding, in ways that aren't always visible unless you choose to notice them. And I pause there because that feels important. To recognize that this story didn't end. It changed, it adapted, it carried forward, even through everything that tried to interrupt it. And maybe that's what I didn't understand before. I thought I was looking at something that had already been completed, something I could learn and then move on from. But now, it feels different. It feels ongoing. And that changes how I sit with it, because it's no longer something I can keep at a distance. It asks for something else. Attention, perhaps? Or maybe just a willingness to see more than I did before. And I don't pretend to understand everything now. If anything, I feel more aware of how much I don't know. But that doesn't feel unsettling the way it might have once. It feels honest, like standing at the edge of something and realizing there's more beyond it than you first thought. And maybe that's enough. Not to arrive at a final answer, but to recognize that the story I thought I knew was never as simple as I believed, and that the people within it were never who I thought they were. So I let that thought remain, gently, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, something to return to again and again. Each time seeing a little more, noticing something new, allowing the picture to grow without forcing it into something smaller. And as everything settles slowly, quietly, I find myself holding on to one final feeling, not certainty, but clarity. A quiet understanding that sometimes the truth isn't something you're given all at once, it's something you learn to see over time, if you're willing to look again.